Today, you'll be learning about dependent and independent clauses. Now, clauses are in every single sentence you'll most likely see. A clause is something that has a subject and a verb in it. They can be dependent or independent. And hopefully for the next few pages you will see the difference between the two and the grammatical rules that we use. Click onto the next page and we'll visit some. This is a sentence. In this sentence it has a dependent and an independent clause. Although it was warm, the man kept his coat on. Now in this sentence, although it was warm is a dependent clause. It is reliant upon this clause, the independent, to make sense. The man kept his coat on would make sense by itself. It is independent, it is strong, it does not need anything else to make sense. Although it was warm is dependent. It is relying upon this part to make sense. Dependent clauses normally start with a subordinate conjunction. Although is an example of one of those. Click on the next page and we'll visit some more. During the week, I always stay packed lunch. Now in this sentence, during the week is dependent. If you in your book wrote the phrase, clause even, during the week, it would not make sense by itself. It is dependent. It needs something else to make sense. I always stay packed lunch would make sense by itself. It is an independent clause. It does not need anything else to make sense. During the week is a dependent clause. And this dependent clause starts with a subordinate conjunction, during. If the dependent clause goes first, you could see clearly the comma, which is used to separate the dependent and the independent clauses. Dependent, independent. As you can clearly see, the dependent clause starts with a subordinate conjunction here, and there is a comma used to separate the two clauses. Let's visit the next one below. While my mum was on holiday, I had takeaway each day. Now here, I had takeaway each day is most definitely independent. It makes sense by itself. If you in your book just wrote, I had takeaway each day, it would be a standalone sentence. It would make sense by itself. It needs nothing else to make sense. On the other hand, this part of the sentence, this clause here, while my mum was on holiday, that does not make sense by itself. There's not enough detail there. There's not enough. It starts with a subordinate conjunction, while, and the dependent clause needs the independent clause to make sense. If this was written by itself, it would not make sense. It needs this bit afterwards to make sense. While my mum was on holiday is most definitely dependent. I had takeaway each day is definitely independent. This part needs this part to make sense. Click on the next page and we'll look at some more. I want you to spend 30 seconds just looking at both of these sentences, deciding which part is the dependent clause and which part is the independent clause. Now remember, independent clauses make sense by themselves. Dependent clauses need the other clause to make sense. I'll give you 30 seconds, and if necessary, talk to a partner to calculate which clause is which. Right, I've given you 30 seconds now. Now hopefully in these two sentences you were able to identify the dependent and the independent clauses. If we think back right, dependent do not make sense by themselves. Okay. On the other hand, independent do. So, despite being mad, my dad let me stay up late. Despite being mad is most clearly dependent. Despite being mad starts with a subordinate conjunction and has the my dad let me stay up late as the independent clause, the bit that makes sense by itself. Dependent, independent. Even though it was, even though it was a weekend, I had to do schoolwork. I had to do schoolwork would make sense by itself. Even though it was a weekend, does not therefore as dependent clause beginning with a subordinate conjunction, even though. As you can clearly see, the subordinate conjunction, when it begins a sentence, places a comma in between the two clauses just there, not directly afterwards. Click on the next page and we'll see some more. Dependent clauses normally start with a subordinate conjunction. Here is a list of some most common subordinate conjunctions. Have a look through this list. Turn the next page, please. In the following sentences, the dependent clause is after the independent clause. Now, in the previous ones I showed you, the dependent clause was first. In the following ones, the dependent clause is after the independent clause. The dog ran home, although he was limping. Now, remember earlier I said subordinate conjunctions begin dependent clauses? Although he was limping is a dependent clause. Although the dog ran home is an independent clause. It makes sense by itself, although he was limping does not. As you can clearly see here, there is no comma between the two clauses. I was full because I ate all my tea. I was full is independent. Because I ate all my tea is dependent. It needs I was full to make sense. When the dependent clause comes after the independent clause, there is no need for a comma. Turn to the next page. We have to stay in the house today if it keeps on raining. Here, the dependent clause is after the independent clause. We have to stay in the house today is independent. If it keeps on raining is dependent. And here is after the main clause, therefore no comma is needed.